People wrote it off in 1988. They said this was only 700 years old. There's no way it could be 2,000 years old. That's why you see that this breaking news we've been covering tonight is so important with this Waxis imaging. So that, without a doubt, it doesn't compute with me, the radiocarbon dating, because it's been shown to be erroneous.
It's one of the most controversial artifacts in history. The Shroud of Turin is a burial cloth that's imprinted with what many believe is the actual image of Jesus after his crucifixion. Now, it's been debated for years, but the shroud is back in the headlines in a major way, with a just-released study finding that the cloth does indeed date back to the time of Christ, and with artificial intelligence having something to say about the shroud as well. Joining us now to break it down is our good friend, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. He's apologetics pastor at Prestonwood Baptist Church, president of the Christian Thinker Society, and author of the great book, Body of Proof. Dr. Johnston, great to have you with us.
Eric, we've got a lot to talk about. This is truly breaking news. I think it's the biggest story of Christianity this year.
Wow, what a way to start. And let's dig into it. First of all, look, a lot of people, I think, over the years have associated the shroud with maybe Catholicism.
Right.
And some people have said, well, it was debunked. It only dates back 700 years.
Right.
But in your research, you found a quite different story. First of all, you're going to break it down for us. But first of all, how did you get so interested in the shroud? You're the go-to guy on this right now.
Well, the interesting part about it is I did my PhD on the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. So a PhD knows a lot about a little, ladies and gentlemen. The little I know a lot about is the death, burial, execution, and resurrection of Jesus. And so naturally, I want to follow wherever the evidence leads. And in doing my study, the shroud kept coming up. And what people don't realize is the Shroud of Turin is the most studied archaeological artifact in the world. There is not a close second. And so when we talk about this finding, we're not talking about just a group of theologians or Bible scholars who want it to be true. We're talking about the most ardent skeptics who now say this is indeed the burial linen cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. And so if I'm wanting to follow the evidence, I couldn't avoid it. So I've gone truly, Eric, from a skeptic of the shroud to a full believer. I think it's a slam dunk. I believe this is indeed the burial shroud of Jesus that the Gospels all four tell us about.
Yeah, and it's amazing that this is happening now at this point in history, in these tumultuous times, Jeremiah. And we've got, obviously, the dating it back 2,000 years to the time of Christ, but also some other breaking news you shared with me off camera, that there is evidence in the shroud of trauma to the person depicted in the shroud.
Right. So there's two breaking news items. Number one is the wide-angle X-ray scattering imaging. This is by the Crystallography National Research Council. These are not a bunch of theologians. So they use wide-angle analysis, and they see that the linen fibers from the shroud are not 700 years old. They're 2,000 years old. And that has rocked the scientific world, so much so that the most ardent skeptics now believe we have the genuine article with the Shroud of Turin. Secondly, to your point about the blood analysis, hematology, when you look at the shroud in person, and I would encourage everyone to look at it, the thing that strikes you the most is the blood. There's blood all over the Shroud of Turin, pints of blood, and it's red. And what we know from the latest finding is there is huge amounts of ferritin, that's organ failure, creatinine, bilirubin is released, which causes the blood to stay red. Normally, with human blood, it turns a real dark brown or black on a linen sheet. But if the liver secretes bilirubin because you're under so much trauma when you're dying, it stays stamped in red. And so the two huge findings that have come out, to summarize, it's 2,000 years old, based on the Waxis X-ray scattering. And number two, the blood report shows us that the way the crucified man died in the Shroud of Turin is consistent with everything we read in Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19 and 20.
Wow, and you lay out 5 reasons why you think the shroud is the real deal. Can you break those down
Absolutely.
for us?
Number one, it's, as we mentioned, it's the most studied archaeological artifact in the world. There is not a close second. And so when we look at the shroud, when you look at the numismatics, the study of the coins, the textile, the archaeological, hematological, historical data, they all exhibit verisimilitude. That's an awesome word, with the world of Jesus. That's a Latin term, verisimilitude. It means it's very very similar to what we would expect to find in the first century in the time of Jesus. What do I mean by that? Well, if you and I were trying to make up a religion or make up a shroud 700 years ago, we wouldn't know things about 13 centuries prior in Jerusalem. We wouldn't know what people looked like. We wouldn't know exactly what crucifixion victims were like. If we wanted to make it up, if the Shroud of Turin was a hoax, it would not look like the shroud that we have.
Yeah.
And so that's a strong point, which led me to believe. And then secondly, to your point, I always thought it was a Catholic relic. I grew up very, very happily, and I still am an evangelical Christian. And so I was really careful. Will people make this an object of worship? And that's a big question I get. Like, does this break the second commandment? Well, no, it doesn't, because the second commandment forbids us from worshiping graven images that are man-made. I don't think the shroud is man-made.
Wow.
The shroud is a miracle, and I'm not worshiping it. I'm doing what John 20 really shows me that Peter and John did. They saw the shroud linen in the empty tomb. They believed in Jesus, and they ran to tell people about Christ. That's what the shroud causes me to do.
Yeah, we've got 30 seconds until the break. You'll be right back with the last 3 reasons why this is very, very credible. Real quick, what did you think of that AI rendering that was released recently?
I loved it. I thought it was striking, nearly cryptic. I like looking at it because it reminds me of a first century masculine Jewish savior. That is the savior that we see depicted in the New Testament. What convinced me, Eric, that the Shroud of Turin is the authentic article, and I do think it's slam dunk, the burial cloth of Jesus, was the best scientists in the world today cannot explain how there is a molecular image in the shroud linen of Turin. This is so important because this is a group, this is a cross-disciplinary group. These are weapons specialists, weapons scientists from Sandia Labs in New Mexico, where they developed the atom bomb. The scholars who went originally in 1978 and had 5 days with the Turin Shroud, they said, give me 20 minutes and we'll prove it's a hoax. All we'll need is 20 minutes. They were giggling and cackling in the hotel lobby because they thought they had gotten a free trip to Italy to prove this thing's a total hoax. One day in, no one was laughing. So the best scientists in the world simply cannot explain how the image is there. If you stand a few feet away from the image, it disappears. We cannot explain with our best scientists how the image is there. That's probably the fact that convinced me the most that it's not a hoax. And then applying my expertise in the historical Jesus, the physical resurrection of Christ, no one else was crucified the way Jesus was. We had crucified victims, remains all the way from Britannia to Italy to Jerusalem. The way that Jesus died was an especially heinous form of crucifixion, Eric. And this is breaking news on your show, things I'm still learning about the shroud. I used to say there were only 372 wounds on the crucified man of the shroud. I actually have to update my research based on this breaking news. We now can count 700 wounds on the crucified man. That means likely, conservatively, 120 whiplashes on his body with that flagellation. Let that sink in for a minute. If we ever doubt God's love for us, Eric, Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrated his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. When I see the shroud, when I see the 700 wounds, that is a demonstration of Christ's love for me that I can't forget.
We were saying off camera that The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson film, seemed to be a pretty accurate portrayal. The brutality in that film, it was the real deal. It was legitimate.
It was. There was a demonic level of excruciating pain that Jesus went through. He died of asphyxiation, trauma, organ failure, and he did it willingly. He did it because he wanted to. So let me get to the next point.
We're on number 4, I believe?
Number 4. So this is really interesting. And we have to go back to the days of film photography. Do you remember like 1-hour photo places where you would take pictures? Well, what was fascinating to scholars, weapons scholars, not Bible scholars, is that when they put the image of the shroud through this machine called a VP8 image analyzer, a 3D hologram of Jesus literally emerges of the crucified man. If you put other images through this VP8 image analyzer, it's just essentially like 2D. But this 3D image emerges. This is computers from the 1970s, okay? And that is what set off this emergence of research around the shroud. You can see that it has a 3D topographical quality to it.
And folks, it's wild. I always thought this was just a flat image. I didn't know it had the 3D quality. That absolutely amazing, especially when you're researching it in the 1970s. And by the way, one of the scientists was a secular Jewish guy
Right.
who became a Christian
Right.
after investigating and
Barry
researching the
Schwartz.
shroud.
Right, and I want to give props to Barry Schwartz for giving us permission to use all of these photographs and all these digital assets. He thought it was a free trip to Italy as well, and he's a Jewish guy. He was a lapsed Jew who now believes, without a doubt, this was Jesus's burial cloth. And so when I look at the way he died, it all smacks of verisimilitude. It's very similar to what we would expect of Jesus dying on the cross in first century Jerusalem. And it also is fascinating to me when I look at this evidence at such a time as this. You say, well, we just need faith. Eric, faith is always defined by its object. We don't have faith in faith. We don't just come up with a faith feeling. We believe based on evidence. And isn't it interesting in these prophetic times, with everything happening right now in Israel, Jerusalem, around the world, wars and rumors of wars, we see these new evidences emerging, but some still refuse to believe. I think about John chapter 11. Lazarus had been resurrected from the dead, and the Pharisees still refused to believe in Jesus. So you say, Jeremiah, does it still require faith when we have such an abundance of evidence for the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus? You bet it does.
Yeah.
And so the most dangerous place that someone can get is to stop seeking truth. And so why I so appreciate you, Eric, every night here on TBN, you help us seek truth. You're a truth addict, and that's why I love your program. I want to encourage us to continue to support it and share it with our friends. We want to know truth. We want to be the people of hope, and the Shroud of Turin gives me that hope.
We forgot to mention the fifth reason
Yeah.
why you believe the Shroud of Turin is very credible as a burial cloth of Christ. What is that last reason?
The number one reason that people doubt the shroud is what's called the 1988 radiocarbon data. That data has now been shown to be completely erroneous. That's the number one reason that people wrote it off in 1988. They said this was only 700 years old. There's no way it could be 2,000 years old. That's why you see that this breaking news we've been covering tonight is so important with this Waxis imaging. So that, without a doubt, it doesn't compute with me, the radiocarbon dating, because it's been shown to be erroneous.
Yeah, amazing. And hey, we mentioned before the break, C.S. Lewis, obviously author of the great Narnia series, Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, many classics. You were at his home in Oxford not too long ago, and we have footage here, folks, of the home of the one and only C.S. Lewis, and a depiction of the Shroud of Turin hanging in his bedroom.
Yeah, in his very bedroom on his mantle. Audrey and I lived in Oxford during my doctoral residency, and I'd never noticed this until recently, that even C.S. Lewis, the great Christian thinker of the 20th century, found inspiration in the Shroud of Turin because it reminded him that our God has a face, and that face is Jesus Christ. And it was in his bedroom. He woke up and he looked at it every single morning. And so if C.S.